Make every night a wonderful journey, no matter where you are. Good night, sweet dreams. The first story, Wheelchair in the Creek. An actual picture of the wheelchair. The sun was out, thankfully, when my friend took me to the edge of the muddy creek and showed me the old wheelchair that was laying half sunk in the brown, thick water. It was only about a mile away from his house. We would walk to a local park, known as Blue Limestone, travel a bit to the woods and then through a tunnel under an old railway. The tunnel itself was unsettling. It was long, and even in broad daylight it was dark inside. The walkway through the tunnel hugged one side and was about 5 feet above a sluggish portion of the creek that ran through it. In the water there were ruined remains made of concrete and steel bars that I could only imagine would have been the other walkway. It was always a fear of mine to slip off of the narrow, often downpath and into the water below, to be impaled on some rusty iron bar jutting out from below. Once we emerged from the tunnel, we walked a further distance through the woods following the same creek. The surrounding area was perfectly safe and non-threatened by day, but by night, the area would fill up with all manner of drug abusers who bought and sold their contraband. Sure, dark woods at night can be creepy, but there's almost nothing scarier than an ill-intended human being. Presently, after passing through a few old ruins, more concrete and metal bars, we reached an area of the creek where the bank was probably 8 to 9 feet above the actual water. Along here there was a well-traveled dirt path that we took and turned off only briefly to find a small outcropping over the water. In the water was the object my friend wanted to show me, the old wheelchair. The thing was, quite frankly, pitiful to look at. Pitiful to look at. It was covered with a variety of muck and marine plant life, as it sat half submerged in the muddy water. From what was interesting under the surface, it was pretty easy to tell that the thing was a dark reddish-brown, a rather common color for wheelchairs. At first glance it looked like just old trash, but something intrigued me about it. My friend was pretty interested in it too. After all, he had come all the way out here to show it to me. "I'm gonna pull it out," I said after a moment of thinking. He looked at me and raised his eyebrows. "I don't think you'll be able to," he said as he looked down at the water. The bank was nearly completely sheer and it was composed entirely of rock. It was like a miniature cliff. However, I was feeling rambunctious and was only urged on by his doubt to impress him. "Watch me," I said cheerfully, pulling off my shoes and socks and setting them on the outcropping. He didn't try to stop me. In fact, he almost seemed pleased that I was going to go for it. Clambering less than carefully down the cliff was no problem. In 6 feet tall, and it took little effort to drop myself gently down to the sliver of an edge that remained at bottom by the water. Now that I was down there, though, the wheelchair certainly looked a lot further out, and I nearly instantly bemoaned my boast of retrieving it. But I wasn't the first one who had tried to get his hands on the wheelchair, which was looking increasingly unattractive the closer I got. Wedged into the wheelchair was a long branch covered in greenish-white lichen, and I seized it eagerly. I pulled gently, half expecting the stick to pop out and loose the wheelchair for good. The wheelchair began inching closer. I nearly yelled in triumph and drew in the cursed thing as close as I could. I tremble now to think how eagerly I reached out to touch it and grab it, pulling it out of the mire. I looked up at my friend. He seemed slightly impressed, but mostly disgusted. "I'm not touching the thing," he said as a matter of factly. I couldn't blame him. The old, wet vinyl was making my hands itch and burn a little already, but I didn't need his help. I had a hold of the wheelchair and no little cliff was going to stop me. I'm not really sure how I managed to climb up the cliff with that soggy mass of rusty metal and stagnant, rotting vinyl in one hand, but I did, and I scrambled enthusiastically to the bank, the wheelchair in tow. There, I said triumphantly, trying to make the wheelchair stand. On its own the axles had rusted out, though, and I think I'd have leaned pathetically off to one side. To me it seemed more like a corpse than an inanimate object. God, it smells. My friend said despite this fact he leaned in closer to inspect it, genuinely curious. I, on the other hand, stepped back to observe my handiwork and take a good look at it. The thing was amazingly grotesque for what it was. Stringy water weeds hung from the parts that had been underwater and dripped slowly on the ground. All the metal had been rusted badly, while the material that had been underwater was in a severe state of decay. The vinyl that hadn't been submerged was cracked, dry and flaky, creating an interesting contrast. "This thing is completely awesome," he said in awe. "I can't believe you got it up the cliff." He pulled out his digital camera, which he always had with him, and started snapping pictures, circling around for better lighting and angles. "I know, right?" I said excitedly. I love to do things that were slightly crazier and off the beaten path. As he continued to capture pictures of our new pet, I looked down at my clothes. I was fairly filthy, and it wasn't up for debate whether I smelled or not. "We should probably get out of here," I said. My hands, which I had up till now forgot about, were starting to irritate me again. "All right," he said, straightening up from a particularly elaborate shot. "You can shower at my place, though we should check this out again later." I agreed. As we walked away, I couldn't help but feel as if the thing was watching us. I fought the urge to glance back at it, and for some reason a tangible sense of relief washed over me as we rounded a corner and slipped back into the safety of the woods. "What health?" I whispered. I glanced at my friend. His mouth was slightly open. "Well, that's not creepy at all," he said sarcastically, though worry and concern had crept into his voice. The godforsaken wheelchair hadn't moved an inch since we left it nearly 2 hours ago. But what was troubling was that it was still dripping wet and was surrounded by flies. My stomach leapt to my throat, but I didn't think for a moment of turning back. I was freaking pumped now. This was simply too cool. My friend must have felt the same way, because he walked up to it, albeit cautiously, and, after all, it was still late afternoon and plenty light out. Oddly enough, the smell was still lingering too, though it was easily to rationalize as it just being the stagnant water. I'm slightly surprised somebody didn't just kick it back in the water, I said, circling the wheelchair, looking for anything abnormal. I noticed that the decaying material had taken on a whitish, almost pus-like appearance on the really bad patches. It was this that the flies seemed to be most attracted to, and possibly the source of the foul smell. I was tempted to cut some off with my trusty Gerber pocket knife, but, thankfully, thought the better of it for once. "I should have brought my camera again," he said. "This is even creepier than before." I rubbed my palm absently on my jeans to get rid of an itch. "Yeah, I suppose we probably shouldn't stay here for long though," I said. I was starting to feel really uncomfortable and restless. For some reason I felt like the night was coming on faster than it really was. He glanced at me, slightly concerned. "Okay, that's fine. I'm up for some LBP anyways," he said, drawing out the abbreviation for Little Big Planet, almost lovingly. The thought of playing horribly made bomb survivals was appealing to me, and I brightened up instantly, decided to put the wretched wheelchair out of my mind for good. I was tempted even to kick it back into the water, but as I contemplated this action, for some unexplainable reason, I felt pity for it, yes. I felt pity for this inanimate object. That flare of emotion itself scared me more than anything else, and I promptly turned on my heel and walked back into the woods. My friend cast one last look at the corpse-like object and followed me. Good Lord, my hands were itchy. I was going to rub them down with some alcohol when we got back to his place. No, I'm so sick of her. I swear she does this crap on purpose, I said into the microphone of the outdated internet phone. I was drawing idly with the Wacom tablet, feeling particularly uninspired that night. Oh, I have no doubt that she does, crackled the speaker with the voice of my friend. I hated having the phones against my face, caused bad skin breakouts. So he was on speakerphone at the moment. By the way, he said after a moment of silence, somebody pushed the wheelchair back into the water. Yeah? I asked. I had forgotten about the wheelchair over the past few weeks, but I wasn't honestly surprised at this. Events the same kind of people who write graffiti on bathroom stalls and idly tear up hospital chairs with their fingernails as they wait for a doctor who one walks through the woods to. Someone innately destructive wouldn't be able to resist kicking an easy target like that 9 feet down into the water. Yeah. I think it'd be fun to pull it out again. Maybe we could put it in the tunnel and creep people out. The thought appealed to me and I grinned a little. If there was anything more fun than being scared out of your mind, it was making other people scared out of their minds. I can only assume you're not willing to touch it still, I asked. No, I'm not creeped out by it anymore. It's a bit of a hike between the creek and the tunnel, so if you pull it up the cliff, I don't mind taking turns dragging the thing, came the response. All right, but wear gloves, I said. My hands itched for hours after touching that thing. What are you doing tomorrow? Hauling the cadaver of a wheelchair around. If you're free. Sounds good. I don't know why I kept going that next day, despite the feeling of dread as I pulled into the driveway outside his quaint Delaware, Ohio house. The dread only worsened as I stepped into the kitchen and greeted his mum, who was busy heating up a plate of food. The food smelled good at first, but it churned my stomach when I took in a deep breath. I had to face it. I was already scared out of my mind, but my fear did not beat out my curiosity. There were still a few things that were still bothering me. About the wheelchair, the white patches, the flies, the smell, the itching. Wait. What the hell? My palms were itching again. I felt my throat close up as a sense of horror crept subtly up on me. This whole thing was a bad idea. I wanted to stop walking up the stairs to my friend's room, turn around, go to my car and drive away. Why? Oh, why didn't I? As I neared the top of the staircase, my feet began to grow exceptionally heavy and my hands began to itch like crazy, forehead sweating. I bit my lip and did my best to ignore the feeling. My friend, however, seemed completely unaffected by the atmosphere that was hanging over my head, and he greeted me happily, looking up from his sketch spot. I felt relief at seeing him so blithe and unworried and laughed at myself a little, feeling the dread slip away. Leaning over his shoulder, I looked at his work. There were 2 girls in a pool of water splashing each other, each featuring a set of fox or cat ears, and in his own unique anime manga style. Impressive, I said. His artwork had always amazed me. Thanks, he said, slapping the hard-covered sketch spot closed and standing up. "Anyways, I've been waiting all morning. You ready to go?" I felt the dread creeping up on me again, but I swallowed it down. "Sure," I said, rubbing my hands together to relieve the itch. He frowned at me. "Still itching?" he asked. I grunted, unwilling to admit the truth lest it made the situation seem even more real. "Yeah," I said bluntly, "only when I walked into your house though. I think it has to do with being close to that wheelchair." I swallowed a dry bit of spittle there. I had said it. He frowned a little and then brightened up. "It's probably just the cats," he said. "I have cats." I pointed out, and even if I didn't, why the hell would my hands start itching? I scratched them again, this time openly and aggressively. "Clark has feline leukemia," he replied, as if this offered some sort of explanation. Great. So I had either contracted hand leukemia, if that was even possible, or I was reacting to my proximity to the wheelchair. My lucky day. "Let's get this over with," I said, sighing. "We don't have to do it," he told me. I grunted. "No, I won't do it. It'll be fun to scare people, and besides, I think I need to convince myself that there is nothing wrong with that wheelchair. I've been scared to death ever since I got here." This seemed to trouble him, but he didn't press further. As we walked back down the stairs and he grabbed his jacket. It was now early fall in Ohio. Weather gets cold quickly. I felt the dread growing again. He must have felt it too, because the nearer we got to the park, the quieter and grimmer he became. "Curiosity is a real stick in the mud, huh?" I asked. He smiled and agreed, and we both cheered up. Now, if I hadn't have said that maybe we wouldn't have cheered up, and then maybe we may not have gone back in the first place. But what's done is done, and there's no point looking back now. It was just like he said. The wheelchair had been thrown back into the water, only this time it had flipped over so the back of the chair was peeking out from under the sluggish creek. It was deeper too than before, but maybe the water was just higher. I had remembered I used to branch to fish it out the first time, so I snapped off a dead piece of wood from a nearby tree and tossed it down the cliff. Then, not bothering to take off my waterproof boots, I had come more prepared this time. I clambered down and hooked the branch through an exposed portion of the wheel that peeked up out of the water. Carefully, I pulled it towards me. At first it seemed stuck, but then it began drifting slowly, and after a bit more encouragement from my branch, it was heavier than I had remembered. Was it just more waterlogged from being more deeply submerged? As it neared me, I saw something grey show underneath the wheelchair. Great. The thing was completely caked with thick mud underneath. I was going to have to clean it off once I pulled it out. Oh, the smell again. It was a lot worse this time. Finally, the wheelchair was within reaching distance. Using the branch as a lever, I rolled the chair over in the shallow water to reveal the annoyance that had attached itself to my prize. To my horror, gripping onto the wheelchair was a bloated, featureless corpse, staring at me with two empty sockets. Its skin was grayish-blue and tattered, long strands hanging from the body as they peeled away. The face was all but gone, the nose and lips long eaten away, with skin hanging over the black sockets like frayed curtains. And yes, it was gripping the wheelchair as if it were still alive, and sinewy muscles could be seen under the slimy remains of the peeling skin. I stared back at the corpse for a moment, confused. Once it registered with my brain what I was seeing, I ran like hell. Not much stuck with me after that. and I barely remember scrambling up the cliff, though an ugly scrape on my knee that later got infected served as a reminder for that. My friend, on the other hand, had gotten a bit more of a vivid picture of the corpse thanks to his vantage point, and had sworn that it had been trying to get out of the water at me. He specifically recalled the wheelchair tipping forward at me as I turned to run. Its movement stopped, only by the stick I had lodged in the spokes to retrieve it. Of course this could have just been natural gravity at work, but I didn't know for sure. When we got back to my friend's place, we collapsed on his living room floor, panting and wiping tears from our eyes as we choked back sobs of horror. However, as I regained some mental stability and motor control, I realized I was absolutely delighted. Yes, it was scary as all hell, but this was also awesome. The adrenaline and curiosity mixed together to form the most incredible cocktail I ever experienced. Oh, God. What is wrong with me? Thousands of things went through our heads in the span of a few short hours. We argued about the possibility of it being a different wheelchair than the one we had taken out of the creek the first day. The why to the corpse strapped to it was a different story. We also reasoned that it could have been a prank or sick joke. Maybe it was even a murder. However, once we had become relatively calm, we came to the general consensus that we had to do two things: confirm what we saw, and also record it. I took his camera, and he borrowed his parents' digital recorder. It was still broad daylight. What was the worst that could happen? The film is worthless. I don't have any. When we got to the creek, it was gone. There was no trace of the body or the wheelchair. My friend started recording, and we did a jittery search around the entire area, even more flipped out and regretting our decision now. I think we both decided it was high time to head back. Looking back, I think we weren't so freaked out to see it was gone because we were so relieved that it was gone. He flipped off the camera and never turned it back on. Like I said, it was worthless because all we recorded was the bank. Something finally happened when we arrived back at the tunnel though, and I honestly can't say if I'm glad that he didn't catch this thing on film or not. Once we were about halfway through the tunnel, and in the darkest part, my friend froze and pointed a shaky finger up ahead. It was a silhouette of a wheelchair, and in its appealing, bloated figure with his head lolled to one side, it seemed to be inching towards us, and the sound of squeaky, grating metal screeched through the tunnel, as well as an odd sloshing sound. The world blurred as I turned and ran, only a split second slower than my friend. I think it did something, because I remember we both slipped and fell at nearly the same time. It wasn't natural though, because we were since running not forward but into the creek below the walkway. My survival instinct was still going strong, and I swam to the surface almost instantly, scrambling out of the tunnel as fast as I could and running onto the shore. All the while the sound of squeaking metal and squelching flesh had filled the tunnel to an almost deafening degree. Once I got out of the tunnel, I looked back. The wheelchair thing was skittering towards me now. I say skittering because I don't know how else to describe it. It was coming at me so fast with a rhythm of jerky movement. Back and forth. Part was that the corpse wasn't moving on its own. It was just kind of flailing around as the wheelchair closed in on me. I could have sworn I saw the head tear off before I turned and ran. My friend and I regrouped a few minutes later, soaking wet and miraculously not hurt. We didn't say much, and both wore grim visages as we shivered and trudged home. It was a long walk back, because we took a mile detour to avoid the tunnel and the creek. I remember vaguely itching my hands as we walked home, wanting nothing more than to take hold of something and squeeze it until my muscles bulged under my skin. When we got to his house, I showered, and since I didn't have a change of clothes this time, threw on a bathrobe I found in the cabinet. Normally, that would be an awkward thing to do, but neither of us was in the mood for niceties. We talked a little bit more afterwards, speaking in dark, quiet voices. I don't remember exactly what we said, but we agreed that it had been a mistake to bother the wheelchair in the first place. What I do clearly remember, however, was gripping the arms of the chair with all my might, trying anything to ease the incessant itch. I also remember feeling hungry, but I was unwilling to leave the chair because of the itch eating away at my palms. It would have been really nice if the chair had had wheels. The second story, Projkatai, ERT-RAG, back WWII, in 1941, as a last resort against fighting the Americans and their allies and a weapon to kill the remaining Jews. The Nazis had a plan to revive the killed Jews using a similar gassing formula to the ones that killed them in the first place. When the gas would re-enter the system, the Jews could not be killed unless the brain were destroyed or the counter gas entered their bodies. The project was titled Projkatai, ERT-RAG, which translated as Project II. Return. These were their exact intentions. The operation was headed by Lothar Johansson, a brigadier general in the Wehrmacht. If anything were to go wrong, he would be the one to command and destroy any stray experiments. Of course, the operation had to be tested on non-lethal subjects. Rats. There would be intended 10 lab rats. One would be treated with the gas while the other 9 remained clean. All 10 would be placed in the same cage to see results. The first rat was placed into the gas chamber, of course. It died instantly, was later retrieved and treated with the secondary ERT-RAG gas. It did not bring it back on the first try, so with some tinkering, the scientists managed to fix the gas's chemical properties to enable the process. On the second try, slowly but surely the rat began to rise. Its eyes glowed a cloudy red. This was clearly a side effect, but a good one at that, mainly because it would mark the infected specimens. The rat was placed in the cage with the others. It did not show aggressive behavior as planned, but merely lolled on the glass floor. Then a bubble on its neck appeared. It burst, letting some gas escape. That gas contaminated about 3 other of the rats within distance, giving them exactly the same trademark, a pair of blood-red eyes. The scientists then figured this was caused naturally. The skin obviously rot faster than a normal rate. The gas pushed itself through the holes that the rotted skin needed. The gas didn't even need the first gas to work. The contamination process was quick and easy. Of course, the gas was intended to make the victim aggressive and attack any who did not have the ERT-RAG gas emitting from their bodies. The gas was then experimented with more to induce the hostile personalities, which had success finally. They were ready to test the gas on the first lab rat. Of course, they dragged in the body of a dead Jew who was then gassed with the counter gas. They placed him in a glass chamber. About 4 days had passed since the project started. At this point, the man began to rise. He looked normal and walked around normally. A soldier armed with a machine gun, however, approached the man in the glass building. The man looked at him. About 30 minutes had passed. Gas bubbles were starting to appear. His skin began to rip to the point to where blood poured down his skin. Veins and raw flesh were visible, although he did not seem to be in pain. His eyes were pure red as soon as he saw the soldier. The newly mutated man rushed toward the glass wall and tried to attack the soldier, scratching and screaming at the wall unintelligibly. The glass did not break, however. The soldier made a grave mistake. In fear of shooting the glass wall, a small bullet hole penetrated the wall and flew into the Jew's chest. But he was completely unfazed. Everyone was screaming and yelling. The soldier was shot several times for his mistake immediately before the man made a big enough crack to bust out. He attacked the dead soldier and contaminated him with the gas and blood. The soldier rose and began to attack everyone with his gun. Johansson attempted to flee, but was attacked by everyone else. One SS soldier had managed to escape the facility uninfected and make the entire facility airtight. The information of the project is completely classified. Many years later, blood-curdling screams can still be heard from the building. Don't EVR get too close. EVR. You may just cause an unknown terror upon the world. The third story. Tying the knot. I used my rope. He used his. My grandfather always butchered his own food. He always said, I don't need anyone to help me eat. He was never the humane type either. He would pick rabbits up by the ears and hold them at arm's length to play Russian roulette with them. We never really kept bunnies long, at least with their heads intact. His favorite to kill were hogs. He would knock them out by hitting them in the perfect place where their skull met their spine, where the spinal cord was exposed for just a few little millimeters, and tie them upside down in his shed now. What he did after their squealing faces were pointed toward the duffel floor, I did not know. Mother started to tell me that I wasn't allowed around Grandpa W anymore. That was after we started buying our own, already killed and ready to stew, meat. When I became an orphan, my mother and grandfather disappeared. I just did not know what to think. I felt lost. I had stolen some of Grandpa W's rope, the rope he tied the hogs with, and that night they both disappeared. The ghoulish shed winked in the moonlight that night. When I grew up and got married to the love of my life, we discovered that I still had the deed to my grandfather's house. Mom had saved it for me, so, of course, we moved there. The cozy little home had rotted and started to deteriorate by the time we had arrived. Unfortunately, however, Grandpa W's shed stood in the backfield, leaning to one side, looking as sinister and grim as it probably looked to the poor hogs that had occupied the inside fences surrounding the building. There were no hogs there now. It is my grandfather's house. Can't we stay and fix it up? Now, how could my loving husband say no to me? Mending the dying house was not much of a chore, since I was with my husband. What's in that shed, honey? I don't know, dear, but it creeps me out. And that was all that was said about the shed, though I always caught my dear husband glancing through the kitchen window at it. No sooner than we started fixing the house did I realize that there were no animals here. No neighbors, no my snowbirds. The unlively feel matched the appearance of the shed. I thought that was strange, but maybe I should have been thankful. No loud noises, no mass holes, no shrieking pigs in the back, until the only living thing that actually matters to me disappeared. Just like my mother, the only place he could be was the shed, for the rest of the house was still half painted and empty. Perhaps he went to look in. No matter how much you love someone, you still have curiosity. I walked up the solemn concrete steps and peeked into the door, careful not to knock it off the one hinge it was attached to the door frame with. A scent of foulness slapped at my nostrils. The only light that managed to break through the darkness was through a broken window and a few broken boards in the walls. The light landed upon her. The next thing I remember was the bloody concrete floor, but I wasn't touching it, just facing it upside down. My love. I managed to choke through the thick stink of rotting flesh. A noise cut through the stiff air. A grunt. A single, bitter grunt. A clash of steel as metal was dropped onto the crumbling floor. I asked, my eyes widened, and started to digest the horror that surrounded my helpless body. There, in the window light, was my dearest companion, my husband, sitting right next to my beloved mother, who I missed so dearly. She was leaning forward. "Mama," I exclaimed. I thought she was standing up to come and tie me. From the metal hooks I'd angled from, the sculpture was knocked onto the floor. A pig body, with a human face. D-A or G-O-D? My eyes could not believe what they had just stumbled upon, and so they could not bring themselves to close to shut out a nightmare I have seen. Like it? I say. I quite Janie Matkin. This here creations. Since you done stole my fucking rope, I been having to use damned animal parts to make new ones, crackled the voice. It wasn't until then when I felt the use of organs wrapped around my wrists, reinforced with pig hide. A cold chuckle followed the disturbing statement. I twisted my hands, but I knew I couldn't get out. I fixed my gaze on my adoring husband, now leaning on the human pig that was once my mother. He had fallen forward also, but his body was no longer limp. He propped his gorgeous head up, and the dejected light illuminated his eyes perfectly. The cheerfulness that filled them not even 24 hours ago had been replaced by dizzying feelings of confusion. I watched as Grandpa W took a butcher knife to my husband. I watched as my husband was skinned alive. I watched the life fade away from his eyes. I watched his beautiful face, still beautiful, as it was sewn onto a rotting pig's body, leather thread in and out of the skin that was used to cover a perfect skull. Oh, eyes, you have failed to cease the show of horror and block it. Why wouldn't you close? You know, I always need help getting me some food, I was told as my leather and intestine vines were released and I was lowered to the floor. This one still needs fixed up. He kicked the butchered man in the floor. So, life alone too much for you now? You didn't need help when I was young, but now that I am perfectly alone you want my help. I reached to the wooden table on my right. I felt the cold handle of my butcher knife in my hand, and I started to swing.